Welcome to the Writers Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little bit more about how they wrote it. My name is Zach Powers. I am the artistic director at the Writers Center, but I am also a writer primarily of fiction. I also have a craft book manuscript, so I'm the most perfectly qualified person to talk about the craft of prose and also writing craft books. And it's really my pleasure today to welcome our guest for the second time joining us for a craft chat, Sarah Fawn Montgomery. Sarah Fawn, thank you so much for joining us. And I was wondering, to get started, if you could possibly tell us in your own words, who are you?
I'm glad to be here again. It's always nice to partner up with the Writers Center. I also want to say before I introduce myself, a thank you to everybody who is here tonight, especially for folks who are experiencing what a lot of disabled folks experience at the end of the day, which is increases in fatigue, increases in chronic pain, just general exhaustion, burnout, those kinds of things. I know that those tend to be worse, at least for me, at the end of the day. And so if you're experiencing those and you are here anyway, I really appreciate your time. So a bit about me, I'm Sarah Fawn Montgomery. I'm a writer, I'm an editor and a professor. I'm also someone who is disabled, someone who is neurodivergent, and someone who lives with daily chronic pain. Another thing that you probably should know about me is I'm an animal lover. I am an avid gardener. I am a general nature nerd who loves all things outdoors and is so glad that spring is finally here in the Boston area. I'm originally from California. I lived in Nebraska for a few years when I was doing my PhD, and now I call Massachusetts home.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So let's turn right to the craft of writing a little bit. And before we turn to the book proper, one of the questions we like to ask our guests is, how and when does the concept of craft play a role in your writing process? Are you thinking about craft as you're drafting? Are you thinking about craft maybe later as you're thinking about revision, or somewhere in the middle, or all of the above?
So my training in my MFA and my PhD, and in the last couple of decades that I've worked in academia, really emphasized that craft was this sort of artistic, literary, weighty subject. And that has never really been the way that I look at craft. I tend to look at craft as like a colossal experiment and a wonderful invitation to fail. I love the invitation to fail. I love the invitation to be sort of messy and to play around and to begin again. So I tend to think of craft more like a recipe or a spell or a game or a puzzle. And I really like the idea of trying something, failing, trying it again, failing again, constantly restarting. And when you're thinking of it that way as something that you start and fail and start again, there's not one way that it has to be, right? There's not one way to play Tetris or bake a cake. You can do all sorts of different versions of it, which takes the pressure off. And that's the reason I like to think of craft in that way. For me, that idea of experimentation starts right from the beginning. So any piece of writing that I come up with is an experiment. It's usually a project or a task that I assign myself. So I'll say something like, let's see if I can write a poem in 3 lines. Now I'm going to try to do it. I might fail. It might be a terrible poem, but eventually I'll keep messing with it. And maybe it'll end up being 3 lines. Maybe it'll be 10 lines. And then I haven't quite achieved it, but the poem's done. Or I might say, I'm going to try to write an essay and braid as many different kinds of threads together as I can manage to fit in one essay. Or in the case of Nerve, it was, let's see if I can write a craft book about how to be a disabled writer when spinal injuries have left me completely unable to write at all. I couldn't write anymore. I couldn't do any of the things I used to do as a writer. So let me just give myself this task, this experiment to see if I can write this book. And in the process of doing that, I learned to write in new ways. And for me, having that emphasis on experimentation and failure really is the best way of thinking of craft for me, because again, takes the pressure off, makes it more fun, makes it joyful, as opposed to a really sort of prescriptive performance that's focused on the end goal of publication. And I think for disabled folks, especially, we're so innovative anyway, because we have to be just to survive in the world, right? That's all we do is innovate to be able to figure out how to live better and to live well and to survive and manage. And so craft is another extension of that. It's another way of innovating in order to create something and to be able to do your best.
I love that. And I love the thinking of writing as a space for allowing failure, for allowing failing. And first of all, you don't get spaces in adult life for that very much. And also I just think, I talk a lot in Zooms and talk a lot in front of people, but also I never feel like I say things how I want to say in this exact moment. So just the concept of revision, like you're allowed to practice the way you want to say things. And certainly I'm better at it from having written, but I can fail there and fix it too. So it's that nice that the fixability of the failure is also such a lovely aspect
Yeah.
of that.
Absolutely. Well, and the idea that there's so many different ways that you could create the same. I mean, you could write the same poem 10 or 20 or 30 different ways. I'm constantly revisiting the same memory and writing different essays about it. Yeah, I love that idea of just the invitation to fail.
Thank you. So turning to this book a little bit, one thing I noticed in this craft book and in other writing on disability, illness, and neurodivergence is that there are two distinct potential audiences. You have readers who have had a similar experience or some experience with disability, and abled readers who might not have direct understanding. When you're writing a book like this or creative work, do you keep both of these audiences in mind, and do you do anything in particular to address one or the other?
Yeah, so for me, I tend to keep both audiences in mind, but the longer I write, the less I am writing for abled audiences. I'm less concerned with writing for abled audiences anymore in my creative work because I find that I have to do so much translation of my personal experiences for abled readers. And what I mean by that is I write primarily nonfiction. I've published some collections of poetry, but most of my books are nonfiction books. And if I'm having to write about myself and anticipate what questions abled audiences might be asking me about myself, and anticipating the way I'm supposed to perform disability for abled audiences, and saying, okay, I probably should list all the different symptoms that I have and tell them about my background. It becomes very sort of overwhelming to have to do that. And it puts a barrier between my story, my lived experience, and the writing that I want to do. It's like this lens I have to work my way through. And it often sort of distracts me from the craft of the story that I want to tell. So as I've been writing a bit more, I've been writing primarily for disabled audiences when it comes to my creative work, and taking some of that pressure off. It doesn't mean that abled audiences can't engage with my work and that I don't want them to. It just means that I'm less concerned with answering those questions. That being said, I do still write for abled audiences, so it depends on the kind of work that I'm writing. So my creative work, again, I'm especially if it's about disability, I tend to write more towards other audiences or other readers who are disabled, chronically ill, or neurodivergent. But with Nerve, for example, I knew that even though this is a book that is for disabled readers, and I'm hoping that it's a book that can really sort of build disabled community, I knew that there were a lot of abled instructors, abled editors, able program directors and reading series directors that could benefit from a book like this, and that just might not know what it means to be a disabled person and to be a disabled writer, might not know about the experiences of that. And so that's why in the book, I have a lot of personal examples of things that I experience that lend themselves to difficulties in a traditional writing workshop or in a traditional classroom setting. And then I sort of explain it and then offer changes or solutions or things that people could do differently in their teaching or in their classroom experience that would make space for folks similar to me or who have similar sort of experiences in the ableist workshop. But even though I do that, I tried really hard with this book to resist the pressures that an ableist audience sometimes gives to disabled writers. So you'll notice that I don't offer any specific diagnosis. That's not something that I offer up in the book. It's not for anybody to know if I don't feel like sharing it. I don't list my medications or treatments. I don't, say whether or not I've tried essential oils or yoga or all those things that disabled people always hear. I don't give hopeful platitudes or anything like that. Those are all ableist pressures that disabled writers often face. And so I chose not to do that. because again, I wanted to make sure that I was sort of being true to myself. And ultimately it's up to every disabled or chronically ill or neurodivergent writer to decide who the audience is. But I think it's important to consider, how internalized ableism sometimes shows up. Sometimes we want to write for everybody, or we feel like we have to write a certain story for a certain audience, because of, again, that sort of internalized ableism. So trying to unpack that is always really important.
I mean, I think this book in particular, written for not for the abled audience, but at the same time, I feel like especially you mentioned instructors or people running creative writing programs, like if you approach this book with any sort of generosity, you have to be changed by it and consider things in it. So I also um, uh, I want to encourage all writers to take a look at this and consider it because I think it's really important. And one thing before we opened the waiting room, we were talking about masking. And it was in particular in regards to visiting a doctor and getting better treatment by putting on a happy face. But I think there's some you covered performativity and masking there a little bit too. And it's really interesting the expectations to perform a certain way to get the results you want from the people you're trying to get the results from. And that might be a reading audience.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to sort of being disabled, neurodivergent, sick, we have and I say we, society has very strict expectations for how you're allowed to be sick, right? You have to be cheerful. You have to show that you've tried everything that you can try. You have to listen to people telling you, oh, have you tried yoga? Even if, in my case, I've got a genetic disorder, right? Yoga's not going to help that. And so there's all sorts of things that you're expected to do in order to be the right kind of sick person or the right kind of disabled person. And yeah, masking is very much a part of that. And I also like to talk about masking a lot because I'm someone who's autistic. And so masking plays a huge role in autism, right? Because your brain and your social skills and your values and the way you experience the world is so different than allistics. And so you have to mask in order to sort of fit in or reduce harm and all those, especially in today's political world, right? So masking becomes this sort of double or triple layer that you're working through. Yeah, and especially in healthcare settings, especially.
Thank you. In your previous answer too, you mentioned some things that you were actually maybe trying to avoid while you're writing this book. And I wanted to ask a little bit more broadly, can you talk a little bit about how traditional narrative structures fail to reflect the experience of chronic illness? I'm thinking in particular of the whole concept of resolutions, which in the traditional sense might not exist in an accurate illness narrative.
Yeah. So, we'll often tell, when we're, teaching creative writing courses or we're thinking about writing, we'll often say, oh, I'm going to find the narrative structure that best fits my story, the way that I want to write something that best explains the themes or the plot or so forth. But a lot of the narrative structures that we read or that we are, studying just don't work when you're disabled. They just don't accurately reflect the disability experience. So to your point, Zach, the idea of having some kind of resolution, right? The sort of typical conflict arc, right? Where you have a conflict, you're working towards climax, and then you have some kind of resolution, even if it's imperfect. That doesn't work when you have a chronic condition, right? There is no resolution. It is forever, right? You might have ebbs and flows. You might have symptom reduction. You might find a great medication or treatment that works. It might work for a little bit and it stops. But for a lot of folks, it's just for forever. You just have, like, I live with chronic pain. I'm in pain all the time. I just have to deal with that. There's not going to be something that makes it any better. And so if we have writers who are being told that you have to have some kind of resolution in your work, and especially if you're writing about disability or chronic illness, you're essentially telling those writers that their work is of value if it has resolution. Their lives are of value if they have resolution. And if a writer starts to believe that they need to have some kind of resolution, it's denying their very existence in some larger way. We're saying that they have to sort of resolve things in order to have the story be important or to be heard. Another sort of example is the idea of linearity, right? The idea of time. So disabled folks often operate on crib time, right? So time is different for us. Sometimes you lose time. Sometimes you have a surgery or you have a symptom flare and you're just missing large chunks of time. Sometimes you can't remember things, if you're taking a medication or you're recovering from something or you're experiencing, a mental health moment, right? Sometimes time is cyclical, right? You feel like you're repeating time because things are sort of changing. And so crib time really means that the ways that our rhythms, our patterns, our values and needs are different than the way that the normative world experiences time. So again, if we apply this to writing, you can't necessarily, if you're someone who experiences crib time, you can't necessarily write something linearly. You might not even be able to begin, in the middle, in medias res, right? Because that doesn't necessarily work either. You might not even be able to move back and forth between different timelines because that might not be how time works for you. So there's another narrative structure that might not necessarily work. And again, this might not necessarily be sort of a narrative structure, but it is something that I think that is important to talk about, especially since we were just talking about like masking. Even things like voice consistency or character consistency don't always work or they work differently. Because if you are somebody who is disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, you don't always have a consistent voice. So you might have one voice or character when you feel great, and another one when you feel dreadful, right? I'm a different person when I'm in horrible amounts of pain. I just have to be, right? It's really hard to be cheerful and upbeat if I'm not feeling well. You might have a different voice or a different character in a personal setting, a professional setting, a medical setting. You might have, if you're neurodivergent and you mask heavily, you might have a different mask or a different voice or character depending on whom you're interacting with. So again, like voice and character consistency, those structures, those craft elements are very different for disabled writers. And yet we don't necessarily teach about them in creative writing courses and in different creative writing books.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's great. I think too a lot about just the arbitrariness of some of our metaphors for plot and structure too. It's like a story is not an arc. An arc is a sometimes handy tool for describing the way a story structures, but there's plenty of other shapes and broken shapes, interspersed shapes that we might latch onto instead. So I think it's always interesting to consider as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
My next question, I do want to say if you have any questions from the audience, please put them in the chat window. I would much rather ask more of your questions than my questions, so please keep them coming. But in the meantime, I do have plenty of more questions to go on my own. Let's consider the concept of disbelief, which I think we touched on a little bit. Do you feel an added pressure to try to get readers to acknowledge your reality? Do you actively write to counter disbelief? And if so, how would you even go about doing that?
Yeah. So it's something that I've experienced or that I've sort of navigated throughout my writing career. I would say when I first started writing and I was first taking writing courses, I was really concerned with addressing every comment in the workshop, right? So I would get a lot of comments in the workshop. And if enough people in the workshop said something, I would go, okay, I gotta address this and take care of this. So if enough people tell you you've got inconsistencies in tense, you want to go look at your tense. If enough people say the title's not working, you want to go look at the title. But what I was finding is I was getting a lot of comments saying, nobody has that many sensory sensitivities. Nobody's body feels like that. You can't be in pain like that all the time. Like, surely you're exaggerating. And the same thing when I started publishing my work, right? So I would have editors that would say things like, oh, are you sure this happened? And so I was getting a lot of sort of questions about that. And because when you first start, sending your work out for publication, you're desperate to publish, I would make the changes, even if they didn't necessarily feel sort of true to myself. And I started to kind of, I don't want to say gaslight myself, but a little bit. I started to sort of doubt myself and to doubt my own bodily experience. Like, am I remembering this correctly? Does it feel that way in my body? And so most of those comments, to your point, Zach, went back to the idea of believability. It was people who didn't believe that my experience of the senses could be the way that I was describing, or people who didn't believe that what I was describing, that my body felt like, they didn't believe that that could be the case, right? And later, after I finished my MFA and my PhD, I was diagnosed with autism, which explains the sensory sensitivities, and I was diagnosed with a connective tissue disorder, which explains how my body moves, my constant injuries, my constant chronic pain, and all those sorts of things. So I realized, it wasn't that I was being, unbelievable, or, I was exaggerating. It was just that folks, the readers, were choosing not to believe me. And so since that time, I'm actually concerned much less with trying to get readers to believe me. I don't consider it to be my job, my business, or my prerogative to try to get someone to believe that what I have to say in my nonfiction book is true or not. I don't need to convince anybody that what I experience as an autistic person is true. I don't need to convince anyone, and I don't want to spend my time convincing anybody that my chronic pain is real. I know it is, and I'm writing nonfiction that says it is, and that's the genre of truth, and I'm trying my best. And if anything, I've actually leaned more heavily into the things I used to be accused of sort of embellishing. So I actually rely much more heavily on sensory description now. Again, as an autistic person, I experience a lot of sensory input. And so I use my senses a lot. They're a gift in terms of my writing, and I do that a lot more. I love to take things to the body. I love returning to, I think it's a great strategy for writers to take things back to the body and to describe the body. So I write about the body quite a bit more than I used to. And what I think is probably the most interesting thing since I've been writing and publishing is that the more that I do that, the more that I refuse to acknowledge disbelief, the more that I lean into those things that folks used to say I might have been embellishing, the more successful I am as a writer. And those are the things that readers often like. Readers will say, oh, I like all your senses. I mean, the sensory descriptions are so unique. Well, yeah, I'm autistic. They are a little bit unique. I experience things in a unique way. And so I encourage anybody who is disabled, chronically ill, neurodivergent, lean into that, do more of that. That's what makes the voice unique. That's what makes your experience and your perceptions unique. And so, I don't worry too much about folks not believing me. That's not my business.
I did some research myself into illness narratives, and one of the things I've talked about a little bit before was this concept of embodiment, that there's this whole other sense that other writers aren't using, this
Yeah,
placing the experience within the body in a
yeah.
way that happens so much more detailed and so much, I mean, I hesitate to say interestingly because it's related to something which is probably negative on the whole, but it is interesting from a craft perspective to see how that has added to the depth of writing in illness narratives in a way that you just don't get for the most part in other narratives. So
Yeah, I think you're attuned to the body. I mean, especially a body in pain, right? Or a body where the senses are heightened. You're so much more attuned to it, and you notice. And when you're someone who has to do a lot of work to manage the body or manage symptoms. When you're feeling great, it's kind of easy to ignore it sometimes. When I'm feeling good, I don't even know I have a body half the time. But yeah, I encourage every writer to take it to the body and to really think about what the body offers to the narrative or the poem or whatever genre you're working in.
yeah, thank you. Have a couple questions coming. The chat's going to ask one more of mine, then turn that direction. So please keep the questions coming over there. So what are some of the main things maybe you've had to unlearn from the formal training and education you've received about writing in classes and workshops, etc.?
Oh, I love this question. Nearly everything. That sounds big and broad, but I mean, so many of the things that we teach about what it means to be a writer, whether that's craft on the page, the business of writing and publication, the daily practice of being a writer. Nearly every aspect is something that I've had to kind of relearn or shift. So if I were to start with narratives about illness and disability, when I was in graduate school and I was writing my first book, which was a memoir about chronic illness and about mental illness, I was getting a lot of sort of interest from publishers, early interest from publishers who wanted me, were interested in the book, but were interested if I could offer sort of a positive spin at the end, right? So like some kind of treatment or some kind of hopeful note at the end, which if you've written about illness before, there's not always a lot of hope, right? Sometimes it just is what it is. And so knowing that I didn't have to do that and pushing against that was something that I've learned, pushing against the temptation to have to over-explain symptoms or illnesses or answer invasive questions. A lot of times in workshops, readers will say, oh, they'll ask a lot of questions in the margin. What about this? Have you tried this? Can you tell me more about this? And you don't always want to answer that. And sometimes if you answer every question about your body, it turns the piece into something else, right? Maybe you mentioned disability in the piece, but it's not a research paper on your disability. But if you answer every question that the workshop has, it's quickly going to turn into that. The idea of having to play the cheerful cripple is something that I've had to sort of work against. I'm a peppy person, but not about chronic pain. Like I'm not happy about that. And so having to unlearn that temptation or the pressure from readers or publishers to do that is something I've had to unlearn. Other things beyond just sort of narratives of illness and disability, the writing space. When I was in school and when I've talked with other writers, they'll write at a desk, they'll write in a beautiful notebook with a pen, they'll type. I can't do that. I cannot hold a pen. I cannot type. I write using a headset and a microphone, and my computer types for me. I don't sit at a desk. I write in bed sometimes. I write in my head at the doctor's office. Sometimes I will shout a line across the house to my partner, write this down for me. It's a great line for a poem. And then my partner writes it down. I'm not a serious writer at a desk with a beautiful notebook and a pencil. It's just not happening. The same thing with my daily, and I'll put daily in quotes, my daily writing practice. I can't write every day. I just can't. No, who can? Who's able to do that, disabled or not, right? If you're working, caregiving, a parent, if you're disabled and managing, different symptoms, it's just not possible. And so learning to reconsider the ways that my writing practice is shaped. Revision is another thing that I've had to sort of unlearn or relearn. A lot of folks will say that to revise, you need to rewrite everything, write every page over again, rewrite that. Again, I can't always do that. So I've actually had to learn to write more efficiently and with less drafts. I write shorter now. I used to write long form prose, and my books have gotten shorter. My first book was almost 400 pages. It's this big old researched memoir. I had a book come out a couple of days ago. It's 90. It's a book of really short essays, 90 pages. That's what I can do. That's all I'm able to do in terms of length. And the last thing I will say is in terms of publishing, I've had to relearn how I think publishing works, or what I was taught about publishing. I used to think that if somebody gave me a deadline, I had to follow it. No, I can set my deadlines. I can say I can't do that. I'm not able to do that. I have a surgery. I have a procedure. Here's what I'm going to need. I've learned to negotiate terms a bit more. So speaking fees, payment options. I've learned to be better about advocating for myself. I've learned that I don't always want to work with a large publisher if they're going to make really specific demands on the kinds of books I'm going to write, especially if they're about illness and disability. So I've had to unlearn a lot, but that's the beauty of it, because again, it was really hard when I was trying to follow all these rules. It didn't work for me. I write about in Nerve. I used to write every day at a desk. I used to write for many, many hours at a time. And that's actually because I have a connective tissue disorder, that's actually what caused my spinal injuries, was trying to write for many hours each day, trying to write every day. If I hadn't followed traditional writing advice, I probably wouldn't have hurt myself, and I probably wouldn't have long-term nerve damage as a result. But again, you live and you learn, and I've changed it now, and I won't make those mistakes again, and I won't injure myself in that way again.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So turning to the chat window for some of the questions coming in from our audience, do you ever feel the pressure of not experimenting enough or not failing enough, going back to our earlier conversation? How do you address that?
Oh, I fail all the time. I don't ever feel like I'm not failing enough. I probably have more pieces on my computer, or when I used to type by hand, more pieces that are saved somewhere or written down somewhere that I've not done anything with. For me, the main thing is being able to feel like I'm trying something new. That's how I keep myself sort of learning. And that's where those little, I call them exercises or challenges come into play for me. I really do. Sometimes I have an idea for like a topic that I want to write about. I write a lot of memoir, so I'll have a memory that comes to mind and I'll go, oh, I really want to write about that memory. But usually what happens is I have a kind of writing I want to do. So I'll say, oh, I want to write poems with 3-word lines. I want every line to be 3 words. I just want to see if I can do it. And I'll do it that way. I'll just sort of reverse engineer it that way. Or, oh, I want to write an essay, but I want the essay to be less than 500 words. Like, I wonder if I can do that. And that's how I keep myself experimenting. I'll give myself little sort of craft-based tasks in that way. And sometimes I don't. Sometimes I get in a rut, a funk, right? So I'm like, oh, I'm writing everything in second person. And then I'll go, okay, I've written like 5 essays in second person. I should probably switch it up. And then I'll just force myself to write into something, a different POV or something like that. But I fail all the time. It's wonderful. It's my favorite thing about writing.
Thank you. Back to the chat window. How do you counter the urge slash publication pressure to tie things up with a bow at the end of a narrative? And what do you do instead to end? And I think that's a really interesting aspect of the question too.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is this pressure. I think we've all seen too many like really cheesy Netflix movies where everything is like, ta-da, it's finished, it's all wrapped up. And I think that is oversimplifying endings a lot. My favorite endings always end on an image. And so when you end on an image, you're less likely to try to wrap things up in a bow, right? You're less likely to try to over-explain. So with nonfiction, which I keep returning to because I write in all 3 genres, but that's my primary genre. With nonfiction, there's a temptation to like prove to the reader that you fully understood this experience and that you know exactly what it means. And if you tell the reader, if you're explaining what it means, explaining what you've learned, explaining what the audience should take from it, it will seem too tidy. If you end on an image, however, and the image, every poet loves a bird, so I'm going to use a bird. The image is a bird flying away. The image is a bird nest that has fallen into the yard and the eggs are open, cracked open. Something like that is a bit more open-ended for the reader to interpret on their own. It has a bit more for the reader to latch onto, and it doesn't wrap it up as much as saying, and that's what revisiting my childhood home means to me. When you do that, when you tell too much, it's too heavy-handed, and the reader doesn't like to be told in that way. So I always recommend an image. And I always recommend a funky image, an odd image. The weirder the image, the better. So I often will tell students, a reader is going to remember an odd image more than they're going to remember a really generic image. So if I tell you that I like pizza, that doesn't tell you much. But if I tell you that I actually only like pizza if it's covered in jalapenos and a lot of sriracha, you're going to remember that because it's a little bit strange. Or if I say I put pickles on my pizza, you're going to remember that. So the weirder the image, the stranger the image for an ending, the more memorable it will be for your reader.
And just another instance, I believe, of this conversation just being so illuminating for writers coming from any particular background, different ways of thinking about ending. There are no rules for this. There's some conventions, and the conventions are it's conventions forcing us towards certain endings, not any reality of telling stories.
Yeah.
So just those conventions are conventions. They're things people have done, and then people say they're rules, and they're making that up. It's not true.
Absolutely.
Another question from the chat. How did you think about finishing a book-length work with disability-related fatigue and other facts of life? Specifically, I am adding to my would-be novel with an 8-hour-a-day job and apparently can't write every weekday.
Yeah, I mean, I have been on medical leave and I still can't write every work day, right? So that's the first thing. The best way that I can sort of finish a book, and even before my injuries, this was the best way that I could finish a book. And that was by thinking of it in terms of Tetris. And I use a lot of video game references, a lot of like game references, puzzles, and those sorts of things. Tetris is about building blocks, right? You are building block your way to a finished draft. So when I am working on a book, I am never thinking of the full length draft. If I think of having to write 300 pages, I cannot do it. I do not know how that's going to work. The way that I think of it is how many days this week can I write? Okay, if I can only write one day this week, then that's fine. And you know, if you want to finish your book in 4 years, 5 years, how many days a week are you able to write on the average week? Okay, how many 100 words can you write each time? For me, because I cannot write very much, right? Because I have, again, chronic pain, I have to use a microphone. I do about around 3 hours of physical therapy every single day, which is exhausting. And I take a lot of medications in the afternoon and evenings that have sedative effects. So I can't write past about like 3 o'clock usually because my brain is not working so well. So what I will do is I will say, okay, I'm going to write 100 words today, and I'm going to write 100 words tomorrow, and I'm going to try to write 300 words this week. And then next week, I'm going to try to write 300 words. And I building block, I Tetris my way to a finished draft. And I'm not kidding when I say I do it 100 words at a time or 300 words at a time. And doing that is really helpful for me. It takes the pressure off of trying to write 1,000 words in a sitting. People who write 1,000 words at a time amaze me. I wish that my body could do that. It can't. It takes the pressure off of having to write that much. It also allows me to write when I can and to maybe even write a little bit extra. So if I know that I'm only going to write 100 words a day, I might be able to write an extra day that week because it's just 100 words and I can do that. If I think I'm trying to write an extra 1,000 words in a week, I will get overwhelmed. So I really do break it into very, very small chunks. Sometimes if I'm working on a poem, I'm writing a line a day, because that's all I can do, right? So I'm, again, shouting at my partner across the house, write this line down, and that's my writing for the day. But if I do a line a day and I'm able to, you know, get 7 lines in a week, that might be a whole poem, and I can be really proud of that. So for anybody who's dealing with chronic pain, fatigue, just the general difficulty of trying to, you know, work full time, raise kids, exist in this timeline that we're living in America, breaking it into smaller and smaller chunks can be really, really helpful. It really does help with that overwhelm feeling. And you'll be amazed at how much adding those small bits together will add up quite quickly.
Thank you. Another question from the chat. Can you speak more about personal privacy versus wanting as a writer to tell the truth?
Yeah. So as I've mentioned before, I am primarily a nonfiction writer, and I tend to be a lot more open in my nonfiction than I am in real life. I'm actually very private in my real life. I don't share a lot of things with the folks around me. I don't share a lot of personal information, even with friends and family. I'm just very shy and closed off a little bit. When I write, I put it all on the page. I tend to be braver on the page than I am in real life, or more open on the page than I am in real life. But when it comes to writing about, I think, sort of diagnoses, treatments, medications, those kinds of things, I do tend to value privacy quite a bit more. Part of this is because of sort of employment purposes. I don't need people to be able to Google me and find things. I'm a teacher. I don't necessarily need people to be able to Google that and find that. And I also think it's a strange time for disabled folks in this country, right? I mean, it's a very, very dangerous time. I'm thinking especially in terms of autism, right? And so I think that there's going to be, for me, in terms of my career, there's going to be things that I'm thinking about differently in terms of being open on the page that I might not have had to think about before, or I might not have wanted to think about before, or had thought was a concern before. But I value the page for the opportunities that it gives me in terms of being open. I always think of, when it comes to disability, the page provides me a safe space when the world doesn't, right? So the world is not always a safe place for sick people, but the page is. So I think that that's why I tend to be a bit more open on the page than I am in the real world.
Thank you. Sorry, I was writing down the page provides me a safe space when the world doesn't. So I got distracted and couldn't ask the next question. Next question from the chat. The publicity aspect of being a writer, doing appearances. If you're sick, are they accepting if you cancel or opt to do virtual appearances? Is there tremendous pressure to go out there and sell it? And is it a deal breaker with publishers to gauge how much footwork you will do to get the book to #1? And how do you handle that?
Yeah. Oh, I love that question. I love that question because I find publicity to be, it's very difficult for me. again, as an autistic person, I'm very shy. I actually really struggle with public speaking. Nobody ever believes me when I say that. But the example I give, especially with students, I did my entire undergrad degree without speaking once in a class. I was painfully shy. I once passed out. I had to give an oral presentation and I just fell over. I literally fainted because I was just so sort of overcome by it, and it was just so terrified. So I do find publicity to be quite difficult. There's ways around it though, especially for folks with again, disability, chronic pain, chronic illness, neurodivergence. So my first book was a memoir. And when I did that, when that book came out, it was a book about mental illness. And I did a big, it was like 15 cities, like 8 different states. It was a very big tour. And oh, it wrecked me. It was so hard. It was very, very difficult. I did not enjoy it. I met some wonderful people though, and I met some wonderful writers and wonderful readers. And so I do not regret doing that tour. When my second book came out, which was a collection of essays, I said, I'm not doing a physical tour anymore. I can't do it. I find it very difficult. I have chronic pain. And so flying back and forth across the country is not something that I can do comfortably. It causes burnout and it causes a lot of flare-ups in terms of pain for me. And I did the whole thing virtually, and it was fantastic. I loved doing it virtually. More people could go. I went to more places than I would have been able to go otherwise. I could do it from the comfort of my house and network with other people. So I really enjoyed that. And the publisher didn't have a problem. The bookstores didn't have a problem, especially because I pitched it as anytime I wanted to work with someone, I said, look, virtual offerings are important. Virtual tours are important. You'll get a lot of people that want to do a virtual tour and want to come to a virtual event. And bookstores can sell copies of the book as part of the attendance for the event. You can do signed book plates. There's ways to still sell books that way. And you don't have to. A lot of people don't need to buy a book. They're just going to come, they're going to listen, they're going to have a nice time, hopefully, and so forth. This time, as I mentioned, I have Nerve that just came out in March, and then I have a book that came out a couple days ago. And because I had a couple of surgeries in the fall, and because I'm recovering from these spinal injuries, I didn't tour. And I don't know yet how that's going to affect things. But I knew that I couldn't do it, and I knew that I didn't want to. I don't want to be in pain. I don't want to risk my body right now, since I'm doing these recoveries and recovering from these procedures and surgeries. And so, again, the publisher didn't mind. I feel confident in knowing what's right for my body. And I always tell folks, you need to look after your body and your body of work, right? It's not one or the other, right? If you don't look after your body, if you know that touring is not going to be good for your body, then what's going to happen is your body of work is going to suffer, because you're going to push yourself too hard touring and not be able to write later on. So it's a balance that has to be struck. The other thing that I will say about touring and publicity is there's really wonderful ways to sell books that have nothing to do with events. There's writing groups, there's online classes, there's if you're someone who uses social media, there's great social media networking opportunities. You don't necessarily have to be doing these big tours, and it doesn't have to be a big to-do. I think having a dedicated group of readers and having folks, connecting with folks that you have common interests with, like other disabled writers, chronically ill writers, etc., that builds your network. Those are the people who are going to want to buy your book. Those are the people who are going to want to support you. And so you don't necessarily have to feel like you have to go be flying to 30 different states, and putting yourself at risk in that way, because a lot of folks are happy to support from the comfort of their own home.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, I think I'm through the questions in the chat window, so I'm going to turn back to a couple more of mine in case, and I'll of course go back to chat window if any more come in. So this one's sort of a personal question for me too, is how do you address feelings of antagonism? In this case, maybe toward the medical establishment or to people who would refuse to or just don't accommodate. How do you manage those feelings, and what place do those feelings have in your creative work?
The short answer is I don't know if I do manage those feelings. I don't know if those feelings are something that I can manage, or that any of us can manage. I always say that the only thing more exhausting than like chronic pain, the only thing more painful and exhausting than chronic pain is dealing with everyday ableism, right? Like those are far more difficult than being disabled yourself. And so I think, the world is not necessarily kind to disabled people. You have to sort of prove that you're sick enough. You have to fight for accommodations. You better not point out disability injustice. You better do everything with a smile. And so I don't necessarily know if there is a way to be able to manage that. The longer that I go on, the more angry that I get. Just yesterday, for example, I posted a video of me opening up my new books, because I had a book come out last week, and I was really excited. I have permanent nerve damage in my hands, and I don't have a lot of strength in my hands, and so I was struggling with the scissors. And somebody on the internet made fun of me, like it made me infuriated. Someone said, "Oh my goodness, like look at this girl, she can't use her hands," and it really upset me. And then again, I just decided, like, I'm not giving that my spoons, right? Like I have limited spoons to give, so I'm not going to engage with that. But it is really, it is really difficult. I would say it does find a place in my work, though, and that's one way that I am able to manage it a bit. And what I do in my work is I allow myself all of the feelings that the world doesn't allow me. So again, the world has very specific requirements for what a sick person is allowed to be: cheerful, happy, pleasant to medical staff, open to people giving unsolicited medical advice. There's very specific requirements. You're not supposed to be angry. You're not supposed to be pessimistic. Have a good attitude. That'll help your prognosis. In my work, I can be as mad as I want. In my work, I can be really annoyed. In my work, I can do all the things that the world won't let me do. And in my work, I can show disabled joy. I can show disabled humor. I can show disabled sex and love, because those are all things that we don't let disabled people talk about. The world doesn't tend to talk about disabled joy or humor or sex and love, but I can do that in my own sort of creative work. And the other thing that I would say that helps me manage it is building disability community. That goes a long way. Disability is really isolating. If you're someone who spends a lot of time, as I do, I'm at home, I'm in bed, I'm in like the physical therapy office, I'm at the surgeon. It can be really sort of lonely and isolating. But when you build community and you network with other folks who are experiencing what you're experiencing, it really does remind you how many of us there are. And if you're someone who doesn't feel comfortable advocating for yourself, it's really liberating to advocate for other people. There's something really powerful about advocating for other disabled people. And so I find that that's a really wonderful way to help to sort of manage the daily frustration of antagonism. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to take one more question from the chat. This is from a former student from BSU. Happy to learn even more from you tonight. Do your current limitations affect the distance you need from a moment before you can write about it? Or is it sometimes important to write about your experiences right away?
Oh, I love that question. And I love that that question's from a former student. That's fantastic. Every writer is different. I have always been someone who I never know how I feel until I write about it. Like I have a very hard time processing feelings in the moment. This relates to autism. I have alexithymia, so I never know what my feeling actually is. Am I hungry? Am I not hungry? Am I mad? Am I sad? And so for me, writing about it becomes the way to understand the feeling itself. And so especially with my spinal injuries, and especially with trying to navigate long-term nerve damage and what my future is going to hold, because my disability is going to progress. Being able to write about it in the moment is a way for me to process it, and I really enjoy doing that. I find a lot of sort of flexibility and freedom on the page to be able to sort of work through things. And I think that there's a real power, there's an agency in narrative, right? So when I feel like I don't have agency in my life, I can have agency in my life narrative. And so being able to construct and shape a narrative on the page, even if I can't do that in my life or in the real world, really gives me a sense of power and a sense of freedom, flexibility. And so I really enjoy that sort of aspect of it.
All right. I'm going to give one last quick question before we call it an evening. What's one piece of advice you'd give to a disabled, chronically ill, or neurodivergent author just starting out?
This would be believe yourself, and believe in yourself, but mostly believe yourself. And what I mean by that is we internalize so much ableism. Internalized ableism is something that is really hard not to have happen to us because we live in an ableist world, right? This world was not designed for disabled people, right? So parking lots, buildings, medical facilities, all those kinds of things, rules, attendance policies, late work policies. So a lot of disabled, chronically ill, and neurodivergent people will internalize that ableism early on, and they'll start to shame themselves and blame themselves for not being able to succeed. I'll put that in quotations, not being able to succeed when we were never going to succeed because this world was not designed and built for us. It's hard to get accommodations. It's hard to be able to, succeed when no one believes your pain is real, when no one thinks that you are worthy of, good health care, social service programs, etc. And so being able to believe in yourself and not gaslight yourself and not blame yourself is really, really essential for you as a human. And that translates into being essential for you as a writer, because when you are somebody who has internalized ableism and you shame and blame yourself, you lose the ability to trust yourself. You lose the ability to trust your instincts about your body, and again, your body of work. And if you don't trust yourself, you're not going to be able to trust yourself to write the kind of work that you want. You're not going to be able to trust yourself to know, what craft choices you want to make, where you want to submit your work, even what projects you want to do. It's amazing how much internalized ableism removes us from our instinct and erodes that trust we have in ourselves. So believing yourself, believing that you know what is best for your body, that you know what is best for your body of work, it goes a really long way. And it's something that I practice daily, is to try and to sort of trust my instinct, trust my gut when it comes to me and also to my writing.
Awesome. Sarah Fawn, thank you so much for joining us again. I'm putting the link in for the free craft chat that we've been discussing, Nerve, today. So please go download a copy to read it. It's amazing. It continues the conversation we've had here in really, really illuminating ways. Thank you all for coming out this evening. And again, Sarah Fawn, thank you for the wonderful conversation.
Thank you all so much. Much appreciated.